One ordinary day, a man named James walked into a pharmacy to buy some medicine. It seemed like a normal situation, but what happened next shocked everyone present. The pharmacist, a man with a smile on his face, suddenly changed his behavior when he noticed James's skin color. His words and actions were full of humiliation and contempt, which left James confused and shocked. But what happened next to this pharmacist? Do you think karma catches up with people for such behavior? Write in the comments your thoughts on how such situations should end. And if you have ever encountered injustice, share your story. Your experience can inspire others. By the way, I'm really curious where you're watching this video from. Write in the comments the country or city you're in. It's always great to see people from all over the world coming together to discuss such important topics. In a quiet town of just over 10,000 people, there was a small drugstore run by Richard, a pharmacist with a reputation for being strict but competent. Richard was known for his ruthless adherence to rules and procedures, but behind this mask of strictness and meticulousness hid a dislike for certain categories of people. One day, in the middle of the workday, Michael, a middle-aged black man, walked into the pharmacy to pick up a prescription. Upon entering, he noticed that Richard was alone behind the counter and immediately sensed something unusual in the atmosphere. Richard, although trying to maintain an outward calm, did not hide his displeasure from the very beginning. At first, he mockingly asked if Michael could provide the prescription, to which Michael calmly replied in the affirmative. During the service, Richard began to display obvious disdain. He handled the prescription abruptly and rudely, not hesitating to make inappropriate comments about how Michael probably didn't understand how pharmaceuticals worked and what he was actually using them for. Michael, patiently and calmly trying to ignore this, received his medication late and in an unusually high-pitched voice, despite the prescription being correct. After Michael left the drugstore, he felt humiliated and offended. He decided not to deal with it, so as not to create unnecessary conflicts. However, his sense of injustice did not go away. The next day, Richard arrived at work to bad news. Something strange had happened just after the pharmacy opened. The automation systems used to manage inventory and process prescriptions had suddenly crashed. Richard and his colleagues quickly began fixing the problems, but nothing went right. Drugs were mixed up, inventory and prescription data had been rewritten, and customers were complaining about errors in their orders. Things got worse when customers started complaining and one major supplier refused to send new shipments of medication until the situation was resolved. The pharmacy was forced to close for several hours to fix the problems. Richard and his team worked hard to fix the errors and get things back to normal, but the tense atmosphere and unhappy customers only made things worse. Throughout the day, Richard couldn't help but wonder if his own behavior might have been a factor in this chaos. He began to realize that treating others unacceptably could have unpleasant consequences that he couldn't have predicted. The image from the previous day, when he had humiliated Michael, kept coming back to him. When the pharmacy reopened, Richard decided to approach Michael and apologize. He was self-consciously embarrassed and remorseful, realizing that his behavior had not only affected the people around him, but it also caused serious problems for his business. Michael, accepting the apology, said that he hoped this lesson would help Richard become a better person. This is a story about how karma doesn't always come in the usual form, but sometimes teaches lessons in the most unexpected forms. Richard was determined to right his wrongs and turn over a new leaf. After the incident with Michael, he tried to return to normal work, but events continued to unfold in unexpected directions. Every day Richard saw Michael, his internal sense of guilt only increased, but unfortunately, this did not stop him from continuing his inappropriate behavior. A few weeks passed, and Richard encountered another client who came for medication. This time it was an older man named Larry, whose views on racial differences were clearly expressed. Larry and Richard quickly hit it off, discussing their prejudices. Richard, it turned out, was happy to share his hateful thoughts with those who shared his beliefs. This only made matters worse. When Michael returned to the pharmacy, he noticed that the atmosphere inside was already poisoned by prejudice and hostility. He tried to remain unnoticed and avoid confrontation, but Richard, upon noticing him, immediately began to demonstrate his negative attitude. This time, the pharmacist not only repeated the same derogatory comments, but also made rude and racist remarks. He spoke of Michael as different and his mere presence allegedly disrupting the order of the pharmacy. Michael felt his patience was wearing thin. He tried to remain calm, but his inner anger and resentment were building up. He decided it was time to take action and file a complaint about Richard's behavior. He considered how best to present his grievances and eventually wrote a formal letter to the city council detailing the racist incidents that had occurred at the drugstore. When the letter was sent, Michael felt some relief, but it only brought more attention to the pharmacy. The complaint attracted the attention of local authorities and community organizations concerned about racism and discrimination. Soon, the pharmacy began receiving requests for an official investigation. The situation at the pharmacy worsened when the scandal was reported on the local news. Racial justice advocates protested outside the pharmacy, demanding Richard's resignation and punishment for his actions. In response to public outcry and government pressure, Richard was summoned to a disciplinary hearing. At this hearing, he was charged with a variety of charges, including racist behavior and violating clients' rights. Michael and other witnesses were called as witnesses, and their testimonies were full of details about how Richard's humiliation and prejudice violated their rights. Amid public pressure and criticism, Richard was forced to resign and leave the pharmacy. The reputation of the pharmacy was seriously damaged and the business was at risk. The public began to insistently demand that the pharmacy take measures to prevent similar cases in the future. Michael, despite his personal struggles, felt that his efforts were not in vain. He became an activist fighting for human rights and against racism, and helped others who faced similar problems. Richard and Michael's story became an important lesson for the local community and a reminder of the importance of fighting bias and racism, even when it seems difficult to resist. The situation at the drugstore was far from over. Richard, fired and stripped of his professional reputation, tried to find a new job, but his past mistakes haunted him. Despite his efforts to correct his actions and justify himself, his reputation was tarnished for many years. Michael continued his work to combat racism and discrimination through local and national initiatives. He organized educational programs and workshops to help people understand how to combat bias and build a more inclusive society. Through his activism, he inspired many others to share their stories and fight for justice. However, Richard and Michael's story did not end there. Richard, feeling isolated and lost, began to do some soul-searching. He sought help from professionals, trying to understand where his prejudices came from and how he could change his behavior. It was a long and difficult process, but he began to realize how deeply rooted racism and prejudice can be in the human mind. Over time, Richard began to work on himself, taking courses on social justice and racial diversity. His path to redemption was long and testing, but he tried to change his views and understanding. He spoke to audiences, sharing his experiences and mistakes to warn others not to repeat their past mistakes. On the other hand, Michael and his supporters continued their work, expanding their efforts and influencing social change. Michael led campaigns to support inclusive practices in business and educational institutions, creating platforms for people who also faced bias. His activism not only helped many people, but also drew attention to the importance of combating racism at all levels. Soon, the story of Richard and Michael became famous not only in their town but also beyond its borders. They became symbols of two sides of the same problem. One person who began a journey of redemption and understanding, and another who used his experiences to change society. This story showed that even the darkest moments can lead to significant changes if people are willing to change and learn. So, despite all the negative experiences and suffering that this conflict brought, it became a starting point for an important dialogue about racism, justice and human values. Richard and Michael's story reminded everyone that change is possible and that each of us can contribute to creating a more just and inclusive world. Over time, the social changes wrought by the drugstore controversy began to bear fruit. The local community began to actively discuss the need for increased awareness and education on racial justice issues. Schools and community organizations began to include courses on bias and discrimination in their programs, seeking to create a more inclusive environment for all. Michael, who continues his work as an activist, noticed that more people were openly discussing their problems and sharing their stories. He organized a series of public meetings and panels where people could share their experiences and discuss ways to combat racism. These events became a platform for important dialogue and allowed many people to find support and understanding. Meanwhile, Richard continued his work of redemption. He became part of a rehabilitation program that involved formerly prejudiced employees undergoing training and participating in activities aimed at breaking down stereotypes. Richard visited schools and universities, telling his story and emphasizing the importance of self-awareness and behavioral change. He was honest about his mistakes and shared what he had learned along the way. Despite his past reputation, Richard began to receive recognition from those who saw his sincere efforts to change. He met people who had once been his critics, but now recognized his path to redemption and the difficult but important steps he had taken to improve himself. This recognition was like balm to Richard's soul and allowed him to begin a new life despite his difficult past. Michael, in turn, continued to expand his influence. He worked with politicians and business leaders to implement diversity and inclusion policies at a higher level. He was invited to various media appearances and conferences, where he shared his experiences and advocated for the importance of treating all people fairly. His efforts began to bear fruit, and the public consciousness became more receptive to the ideas of equality and justice. Soon after Richard and Michael's situation became more known nationally, it began to inspire other cities and regions to hold similar events. The community became more active in the fight against racism and bias, and many initiatives emerged to create a more equitable society. The story of Richard and Michael has become a lesson for many. It has shown that even the deepest biases and mistakes can be corrected if there is a sincere desire to change and learn. It has also emphasized that working on yourself and fighting for justice is an ongoing process that requires effort and persistence. Ultimately, Richard and Michael became symbols of change, showing how personal tragedy and conflict can lead to significant societal change. They showed that each of us is capable of change, and that growth and understanding can be achieved through hardship and mistakes. Their story remains a reminder of the importance of humanity, empathy, and the pursuit of justice. Over the years, Michael and Richard's work began to pay off, and significant changes began to occur in their community. Education programs and community initiatives helped raise awareness of racial justice, and more people began to recognize the importance of fighting bias. But despite the positive changes, the problem of racism and discrimination did not disappear completely. In one of the big cities where Michael continued his activism, another incident occurred that reminded him how deeply ingrained racism is in society. That evening, after a large anti-racism event, Michael received a message that a case of gross discrimination had occurred in one of the local schools. A young teacher recently hired at the school showed clear prejudice against minority students. He openly disregarded their opinions, lowering their grades and creating an atmosphere of unfriendliness and hostility. One day, during a lesson, he made derogatory comments about a student named Kevin, whose parents were from another country. The incident became known through recorded conversations and complaints from other students, causing a wide public outcry. Michael, upon learning of the incident, immediately got involved in solving the problem. He held a meeting with parents, teachers, and school administration to discuss the situation and propose ways to resolve it. Together with other activists and organizations, he organized a campaign to collect signatures for the dismissal of the teacher and reform of the educational program at the school. However, not everyone supported his actions. Some local residents and officials objected to the campaign, claiming that the accusations were exaggerated and that the whole situation was just inflating the problem. In response, Michael and his supporters held a series of public demonstrations and educational events to highlight the importance of fighting racism and the need for change in the educational system. These events attracted the attention of national media, which began to highlight the problem of racism in the education system. Michael and his colleagues continued to raise questions about the need for anti-crime programs and inclusive education. Their work became even more urgent in light of new examples of racist behavior that began to emerge elsewhere. Against this backdrop, Richard, who had been continuing his work of atonement and education, was drawn to Michael's case. His own journey of change and understanding was an example to others, and he took part in several public discussions on racism and bias. He spoke to students and teachers, emphasizing the importance of creating an inclusive educational environment and the importance of admitting and correcting one's own mistakes. Kevin's story and that of other students who faced discrimination served as a reminder that even in the midst of significant change, racism remains a persistent issue. Michael and Richard continued their work, recognizing that the fight for justice and equality is an ongoing process that requires effort and persistence. Their experiences and efforts were important steps toward creating a more just society, but they also served as a reminder that overcoming bias requires constant vigilance and action at all levels. 5 years later, after many efforts to improve the social climate and raise awareness about racism, a new wave of concern began to emerge in the community. Michael and Richard continued to actively work to create a more inclusive society, but despite their efforts, the problems of racism did not completely disappear. In one of the major cities where Michael recently organized a seminar on inclusion and anti-discrimination, another incident occurred. This time it happened at a popular sports club where many people gathered for training and social events. The new club management decided to launch an advertising campaign that would feature local sports stars and public figures. However, one of the advertising campaigns created to promote the club contained elements that many considered racist. The visuals used in advertising banners and social media depicted stereotypical images of people from different ethnic groups in a derogatory context. Additionally, the advertising campaign was primarily aimed at one ethnic group, which led to criticism from other community members who felt excluded and undervalued. Minority communities began to actively discuss the issue, raising questions about how advertising and media can contribute to stereotypes and discrimination. Michael, who was aware of the situation thanks to his contacts in public organizations, immediately drew attention to the problem. He initiated a meeting with the club management, where he presented evidence and examples of racist and discriminatory elements in the advertising. Together with other activists and opinion leaders, Michael organized public discussions and protests, demanding changes in the club's advertising strategy and an apology from its management. Meanwhile, Richard, who had already established himself as an advocate for anti-crime programs, was back in action. His personal experiences and behavioral changes became an important example for others, and he spoke at public events emphasizing the importance of cultural sensitivity in advertising and media. He also offered to organize inclusivity training for the club's employees to avoid similar situations in the future. The controversy became widely discussed in local and national news. In response to public pressure, the club's management began to review its advertising strategy and conduct an internal investigation. They acknowledged that the campaign did contain elements that could be perceived as racist and stereotypical. As a result, the club apologized to the public, withdrew the disputed advertisement, and took steps to improve its practices. Michael and Richard continued their efforts to create a more inclusive society. Their work became even more urgent as new incidents of racism and bias continued to surface. They began developing new educational programs and resources to help organizations and communities cope with and prevent such issues in the future. This latest incident reminded everyone that the fight against racism is not a one-time task, but an ongoing process that requires vigilance, education, and action. Michael and Richard's story once again highlighted the importance of working on ourselves and our role in society, as well as the need to continually work to create a more just and inclusive world. Several weeks passed after the incident with the club's advertising campaign. Public attention to the situation continued to grow, and pressure on the club's management increased. Despite attempts to rectify the situation, the club faced a growing number of protests and boycotts. People began writing negative reviews, canceling memberships, and demanding compensation for moral damages. During this time, Michael and Richard continued their work on public opinion reform and education. Michael held more events and discussions aimed at creating an inclusive environment in sports clubs and other public organizations. Richard, in turn, worked on new projects related to the fight against discrimination in the media and advertising. However, the situation at the club not only did not improve, but also worsened. At one of the protests organized in solidarity with the victims, an incident of violence occurred. A group of protesters clashed with counter-protesters who were supporters of the club. The conflict quickly escalated into a fight, and as a result, several people were seriously injured. The incident attracted national news attention and further inflamed public opinion. Michael and Richard faced increasing threats. Their personal details were shared online and they began receiving threats. Some people accused them of inciting conflict and damaging the club's reputation, which put additional pressure on their mental health. Michael, in particular, felt exhausted and depressed. His family was also under stress due to the constant media attention and threats. Meanwhile, the club began to experience internal problems. The management, under public pressure, decided to replace key employees, but this only worsened the situation. The new employees did not have the necessary experience and were unable to effectively cope with the crisis. Internal disagreements and discontent among the employees only increased. A major turning point was the emergence of a new scandal. It was revealed that one of the board members had a past of racist remarks and actions. This revelation caused even more public outrage. The revelations were a real blow to the club's reputation and its attempts to improve. Michael and Richard found themselves at the center of the crisis. Their own turnaround efforts were criticized from all sides, accused by some of being too aggressive, by others of not being proactive enough. Meanwhile, the club found itself in financial crisis, with membership declining and losses mounting due to boycotts and lawsuits. Richard was invited onto a TV show to discuss the situation and propose solutions. He gave a speech about the importance of honest and open dialogue, but as the show ended, he received harsh criticism from some viewers who felt his proposals were insufficient. He also faced backlash on social media, where his ideas for reforming the club were criticized as too soft. Michael, meanwhile, found himself under pressure from both his supporters and opponents. His initiative to organize a new protest event ran into trouble when a group of his supporters disagreed on how exactly to interact with the club and the community. Internal disagreements among activists only complicated the situation. And so, in the midst of the crisis, when everything seemed to be on the brink of disaster, Michael and Richard received an invitation to meet with representatives of the national government. The authorities had decided to intervene and offered to mediate to resolve the conflict. This meeting could be a turning point in the crisis, but it was also full of uncertainty. Michael and Richard knew that the results could have far-reaching consequences, and they were unsure what to expect. The story of the sports club scandal and Michael and Richard's fight against racism continued to unfold, and all the questions remained open. Such crises take time, patience and effort, and each side had to understand that the path to justice and understanding was a long and difficult one. The meeting with national government officials, which took place a week after the invitation was received, was tense and unpredictable. Michael and Richard arrived at the meeting full of hope, but also apprehension. The presence of high-profile government officials and representatives of human rights organizations gave the meeting special importance. During the talks, possible ways to resolve the conflict were discussed. Government representatives proposed to set up an independent commission to conduct a detailed investigation within the club and develop recommendations to rectify the situation. They also proposed a temporary financial allowance for the club to help it cope with the economic difficulties caused by the crisis. Michael expressed his support for the proposal to establish a commission, but noted that it must be fully transparent and independent of pressure from the club. He also called for immediate changes to the club's advertising strategy and practices to prevent similar situations from happening in the future. Richard supported the committee's idea, but added that a deep rethink of the club's culture and policies was needed to truly improve the situation. He suggested racial sensitivity training for all staff and a program aimed at creating a more inclusive environment. The crisis, however, continued to escalate. A few days after the meeting, another incident occurred at the club that made matters worse. At one of the club's fundraising events, one of the speakers made an offensive remark about a minority participant. This caused a wave of indignation among those present and again attracted media attention. Michael and Richard, realizing that the situation required immediate attention, decided to hold an emergency press conference. They issued a strong condemnation of the recent incident and emphasized the need for immediate and decisive action by the club. Their speech was emotional and full of determination, but it also drew attention to the fact that the problem was far from over. In the wake of these events, internal divisions among the club's members intensified. Some employees began openly expressing dissatisfaction with the management, and reports of internal sabotage and conflicts of interest emerged. Rumors began to circulate within the club that the management was hiding certain details about the internal investigation and manipulating information to avoid further repercussions. Public pressure reached its peak, and national media continued to actively cover the events. The escalation of the crisis attracted attention at a higher level, and human rights organizations began to actively intervene in the situation. They conducted their own research and found additional problems within the club that had not been identified by the official commission. Michael and Richard continued their work, but the pressure and stress began to affect their personal lives. Michael found his family was being targeted on social media and had to tighten his security measures. Richard, who had previously tried to project a positive image, also faced personal threats and criticism. Meanwhile, the club, in crisis, began to look for ways to solve the problem. Internal disputes and increasing public pressure led to the management considering the possibility of a complete revision of its advertising and marketing strategy. However, the changes proposed by the club were perceived as insufficient and too late. The crisis escalated to a climax when one of the club's main sponsors announced its intention to withdraw funding if the situation was not resolved within 2 weeks. The decision threatened the club's financial collapse and further increased the pressure on the board. Michael and Richard found themselves at the center of a growing conflict. They knew their actions could have serious consequences for both the club's culture and their own careers. Both knew they had to find a solution that could unite the disparate parties and bring about lasting change. But the road to getting there was rocky and difficult. History continued to unfold, and new challenges were posed to all parties involved. The struggle for justice and inclusion continued, and no answers were final. It had been several more weeks since Michael and Richard had faced a crisis at the sports club. The situation had continued to deteriorate, and public attention had focused on the club and its internal struggles. However, amid the crisis, another unpleasant reminder had emerged of how issues of racism can overshadow people's lives. Michael and Richard, despite their efforts and accomplishments, could not forget an incident that had occurred at the hospital several years earlier. The event that had once led them to a common cause continued to be an important reminder of how deeply ingrained racism and bias were in society. The hospital incident was not an isolated incident. A recent social media post revealed that the same hospital where the pharmacist row had occurred was again experiencing bias. This time, it involved a nurse who was caught up in a scandal over how she treated patients from different ethnic groups. The patient, an African-American man named James, presented to the hospital with a serious medical condition. His medical records were ignored and he was not given proper care. James and his family felt that his condition was underestimated and that the hospital staff was negligent, which they claimed was due to bias. The case brought racism in the medical field back into the public eye and became a topic of public debate. New protests and campaigns like those Michael and Richard had previously organized once again filled the headlines. James' case became a symbol of ongoing problems in healthcare systems, and his story showed that even after one incident was corrected, the problem did not go away. Michael and Richard, hearing about the new incident, felt they had to intervene. They reached out to James's family and offered to help them rally support and raise awareness. Their involvement brought racism in healthcare back into the spotlight and showed that the work to combat bias is unfinished. Michael, recognizing that issues of racism in healthcare settings may be even more complex than in commercial settings, began working to create new initiatives to monitor and report on racial discrimination in healthcare. He proposed developing a program that will allow patients to anonymously report incidents of discrimination and bias, which could help combat these issues more transparently and effectively. Richard, who has continued his work to redeem himself and improve his skills in the field of social justice, actively supported Michael in this initiative. He also spoke at public events, sharing his own stories and calling for systemic changes in healthcare. His experiences in fight for justice have become important examples for other people and organizations seeking change. At the same time, the crisis at the sports club continued to mount. The situation with funding and internal conflicts worsened, and the club was forced to make difficult decisions to cope with financial pressure and preserve its reputation. The club's failures and new problems in healthcare created a tense atmosphere and required even greater effort and persistence from Michael and Richard. As the story continued to unfold, Michael and Richard realized that their work was far from done. Each new challenge reminded them of the importance of continuing to fight for justice and equality, despite all the difficulties and obstacles. As time went on, they continued to work, understanding that change is only possible through hard work and persistence. As public attention grew on James's case and the racism at the hospital, the situation became even more tense. The investigation found that racial discrimination issues at the hospital were far from isolated. Problems with bias and inadequate care were deeply rooted in the system. Deepening problems. Internal investigations revealed that not only Dr. Lancaster but other doctors and nurses had engaged in discriminatory behavior. It emerged that there was a culture of silence at the hospital in which racist remarks and actions were common and victims were afraid to report them for fear of reprisals. Michael and Richard, recognizing that the situation required urgent and far-reaching action, proposed a full internal investigation and an independent audit of all departments of the hospital. They also initiated the creation of an anonymous discrimination reporting program to provide patients with a safe place to report such incidents. But not everyone at the hospital supported these initiatives. Employees who had engaged in discriminatory behavior began to actively resist the changes. Signs of sabotage appeared at the hospital, complaint reports were disappearing, and information about investigations was leaked to the press, allowing the accused to avoid responsibility. Personal confrontation. Michael and Richard began to face increasing threats. Their efforts to remedy the situation attracted the attention of not only community groups, but also those who considered their intervention unnecessary and destructive. A campaign began on social media and forums against Michael and Richard, accusing them of inciting hatred and causing problems at the hospital. One day, at a public event aimed at discussing racial discrimination, Michael and Richard were attacked by a group of protesters who supported discriminatory behavior at the hospital. The confrontation escalated into a fight, and Michael was injured. Doctors working at the hospital found themselves at the center of a scandal when it was revealed that they had deliberately ignored Michael's injury and also failed to provide the necessary care to other victims. Expansion of conflict. The situation at the hospital reached a critical point when public protests turned violent. Demonstrations organized by Michael and Richard became targets for counter-demonstration groups, who began to actively intervene. During the protests, clashes with police occurred, leading to additional arrests and a deterioration in public order. Internal divisions among the medical staff and active resistance from some hospital workers made the reform process even more difficult. The escalation of the conflict led to many minority patients avoiding the hospital for fear of discriminatory treatment and inadequate medical care. New revelations. Soon, more revelations emerged. Some of the hospital's leadership, including some high-profile doctors, had ties to groups that espoused racist ideologies. These ties led to complaints being systematically ignored and discrimination being covered up. Internal documents leaked showed that the leadership was deliberately making decisions that made conditions worse for minority patients. This new round of crisis led to civil society and human rights organizations demanding the resignation of the hospital's management and a complete overhaul of its policies. Mass protests demanding change began to take on more radical forms, with many demonstrators launching campaigns against those seen as responsible for maintaining the status quo. Personal confrontation and uncertainty. Michael and Richard continued to fight despite increasing pressure and threats. They knew that every action they took could have serious consequences. Their families became targets for threats and attacks, and both parties were under constant stress. The situation at the hospital and the public unrest showed no signs of abating. Amid ongoing protests, threats, and internal sabotage. Michael and Richard faced ever-increasing difficulties. The path to justice and change seemed increasingly difficult and thorny, and every step forward presented them with new challenges and risks. Michael and Richard's story continued to unfold, with uncertain consequences. Whether they could make a difference remained an open question, and the struggle against racism and discrimination continued to shape their lives. Reconfiguration and conflict intensification. Several months passed, and the crisis at the hospital continued to escalate. The escalation of the conflict led to new and more dramatic turns. Despite Michael and Richard's efforts, the changes at the hospital did not lead to significant improvements. Instead, the situation only worsened, and new incidents of discrimination began to attract even more attention. One day, during a particularly tense moment, the hospital received an emergency case. A woman named Layla, pregnant and in need of urgent medical care, was rejected based on racial bias. Layla, who was African American, was denied the medical care she needed, despite her critical condition. When her family investigated, they discovered that her case was one of several that had been ignored for the same reason. This situation caused a new wave of public outrage. The protests outside the hospital became larger and the demands for reform grew stronger. Michael and Richard organized another series of actions, but they faced growing opposition. From time to time, the protests turned violent, which only worsened the situation and caused a social and political crisis. Deepening internal disagreements. Internal divisions among hospital staff reached a critical point. The confrontation between those who supported change and those who resisted reform became more pronounced. Employees who supported discriminatory practices began to sabotage new initiatives. They disregarded new protocols, sabotaged training programs, and tried to undermine reform efforts. This has led to a deterioration in the quality of care, making life difficult for patients, especially those from minority groups. In several cases, patients have been subjected to unnecessary delays and errors, further undermining trust in the hospital. Personal tragedies. Michael and Richard's personal lives also began to suffer. Attacks on their families and threats became a daily reality. Michael, traumatized by the attack, was forced to temporarily withdraw from active work, but remained at the center of the fight through his contacts and associates. His family found themselves under constant surveillance and threats, which created even more stress. Richard, in turn, faced growing discontent in his professional environment. He began to receive threats from colleagues and faced massive attacks on social networks, which greatly affected his emotional state. His participation in events and actions attracted even more attention and aggression from supporters of those who opposed the reforms. New escalations and secret actions. The problems at the hospital and public pressure led to covert manipulation in some circles. Some hospital officials tried to hide information about the real scale of discrimination by organizing data falsification and suppression of negative information. Michael and Richard discovered that some of the documentation surrounding the discrimination incidents had been falsified and that some hospital staff had begun to intimidate witnesses and victims. These findings led to new investigations and a renewed wave of public outrage. Political reaction and revolutionary change. As the crisis deepened, local authorities began to take more serious action. Politics began to play out as various groups began to exploit the situation for their own ends. Some politicians supported Michael and Richard, offering help and resources to combat discrimination. Others used the situation to further their own ends, further confusing the situation and making the reform process more difficult. The situation at the hospital remained unstable, and the need for systemic change became more apparent. Public pressure and prolonged protests led to the creation of a new law on transparency and accountability in medical institutions, which promised to bring significant changes to the system. However, the implementation of new measures faced many obstacles and resistance, making the path to real change long and difficult. Michael and Richard's story continued to unfold, and their fight for justice and equality continued. They understood that every step they took could have consequences, and they were willing to continue their work despite the difficulties. Uncertainty and difficult challenges remained their constant companions, but their determination and desire for change continued to move them forward. Michael and Richard, despite all the difficulties and personal threats, continued to fight for justice. However, public sentiment and events in the hospital became increasingly tense. After new facts about systemic discrimination and concealment of information came to light, the situation became even more tense. Ongoing protests and public pressure forced the hospital to tighten security measures, while activists and human rights defenders continued their work. Racism and bias seemed to only increase in some circles. Michael and Richard faced outright hate. They began receiving threats from groups that openly expressed their racist views and supported discriminatory practices at the hospital. These groups used social media and other channels to spread their hatred and denounce Michael and Richard for their work. Michael, despite his efforts, found himself at the center of a new wave of attacks. His family continued to face threats and aggression, creating a constant sense of insecurity. He and Richard received support from some politicians and public figures, but their efforts were not always enough to cope with the growing threat. The hospital began to experience new incidents of discrimination that confirmed systemic problems. Some employees who supported discriminatory practices used their positions to retaliate against minority patients. This situation led to an increase in cases of ignoring complaints and denying medical care, which further exacerbated public discontent. As tensions mounted, situations in and around the hospital became more dramatic. Protests continued, and public pressure on the hospital's leadership increased. But every action and word of Michael and Richard became the subject of new attacks from those who opposed their efforts. At one point, in the latest incident, one of the hospital's medical workers, who openly supported discriminatory practices, attacked Michael in a public place. The attack sparked a wave of public outrage and drew attention to the scale of the problem. The situation at the hospital became more tense, and demands for the resignation of some of the leaders and reform of the system only intensified. Michael and Richard continued their struggle, facing increasing resistance and threats. They knew that changing the system would take time and effort, and that their work was just beginning. But each new challenge, each threat, and each injustice reminded them that their journey toward justice and equality would be long and difficult. After the events at the hospital, Michael and Richard's lives changed dramatically. Public pressure and revelations about racism in the medical establishment led to significant changes, but not all of them were positive. Michael, who had been forced to move to another city because of threats and attacks, continued to work actively on racial justice issues, but his work was now under constant surveillance. He had become a well-known figure in the social movement, and his story attracted the attention of both supporters and critics. His new projects focused on advocacy and helping victims of racial discrimination, but every action he took was now accompanied by danger and challenges. Richard, who also faced many challenges, continued his work in the human rights field, but his activities became more cautious. He tried to find a balance between his activism and his personal safety. Richard began consulting with organizations and human rights groups, helping them develop strategies to combat discrimination and bias. At the hospital itself, following widespread protests and public pressure, some reforms began. New procedures and policies were introduced to prevent discrimination. However, even with the changes, the situation remained unstable. Some employees, unhappy with the new rules, continued to sabotage the reforms and create problems for patients. The hospital faced financial difficulties due to the loss of reputation and the decline in patient numbers. New control and reporting measures resulted in additional costs, and the institution had to find ways to restore its image. At the same time, cases of discrimination continued to appear despite the reforms, undermining the credibility of the hospital. Amid these changes, community and advocacy groups continued to support Michael and Richard, creating new campaigns and events. They used the attention to the hospital case to raise broader questions about racial justice and discrimination in other areas of life. Despite the achievements, the path to change was difficult and full of challenges. Michael and Richard continued to face resistance and criticism, and their personal lives remained at risk. Both continued their work, recognizing that the fight for equality and justice was not over, and that the system required constant attention and action. The escalating conflict and ongoing challenges reminded them of how deeply rooted the problems of racial discrimination were. They understood that real change would take time, effort, and public support, and despite the challenges, they were willing to continue their work, knowing that their fight mattered and could bring about the change they longed for. Following the public outcry over discrimination at the hospital, Dr. Lancastra's life changed dramatically. His name became a symbol of racist behavior in the medical community, and he found himself in the spotlight of both the media and human rights organizations. Dr. Lancaster, initially confident of his immunity and protection from the proponents of discriminatory practices, now faced serious consequences. After his past actions were revealed, his career was in jeopardy. He was suspended from work, and a formal review of his professional activities was launched. This review revealed numerous violations and biases in his work, which only made his situation worse. The public condemnation of Dr. Lancastra was swift and brutal. The media began to actively cover his story, focusing on his racist statements and actions. Television programs and articles in the press discussed his biased behavior, leading to the formation of a group of protesters calling for his complete resignation and the loss of his medical license. As a result of public and human rights pressure, the hospital was forced to take action against Dr. Lancaster. Although the official investigation found numerous violations related to his professional activities, Lancaster himself continued to deny his guilt and claimed that his actions were misinterpreted. He also accused the hospital management of using him as a scapegoat to distract attention from systemic problems. Meanwhile, Dr. Lancastra began to have serious problems in his personal life. His name became synonymous with racism, which led to social isolation. He became a target for threats and aggression from the public. His family also faced difficulties, as their connections and personal details became known, which led to a series of threats and even acts of vandalism. Dr. Lancaster tried to find work in other medical institutions, but his reputation proved to be a serious obstacle. His professional connections were severed, and many medical institutions refused to hire him. As a result, he found himself in a difficult financial situation and was forced to seek legal support and find ways to preserve his medical education and rights. As the investigation and subsequent trial continued, Lancaster found his career and personal life in jeopardy. Despite his efforts to clear his name and position, he knew the consequences of his actions would haunt him for a long time. Dr. Lancaster became a symbol of how racism and bias could destroy not only a career but also a personal life, and his story continued to draw attention as a warning about the consequences of discrimination. Dr. Lancaster, at the center of public anger, faced a growing fear that permeated every aspect of his life. Every day his situation became more tense, and fear began to dominate his consciousness. From the start, after his name became a symbol of racism in the medical community, Lancaster faced threats that became increasingly serious. Amid constant media attention and public condemnation, he began receiving anonymous letters and phone calls threatening violence. The threats became so persistent that he was forced to change his habits and security measures. Lancaster stopped leaving his house without protection, and his family was also under threat. In the evenings, when he returned to his new, temporary home, his car was damaged several times by vandals. Abusive messages and graffiti began to appear on his house. This fear became so overwhelming that he could not sleep peacefully and constantly expected another attack. Once, after his car was set on fire by unknown assailants, Lancaster filed a police report, but his calls often went unanswered. Contrary to his expectations, law enforcement agencies were not always able to provide the necessary level of protection, which only increased his fear and sense of hopelessness. In the wake of these events, Dr. Lancaster became increasingly withdrawn. He began to experience panic attacks and severe anxiety. His personal and professional contacts were greatly reduced, as many colleagues and friends began to distance themselves from him, fearing the negative consequences of their interactions with him. This isolation only worsened his condition, and he began to seek psychological help more often. In addition, the public pressure on him continued to mount with each passing day. It became clear to him that dealing with his reputation and the consequences of his actions required not only legal efforts, but also personal sacrifice. Dr. Lancaster had become a victim of his own bias, and his fear that his actions could lead to even more serious consequences began to take its toll on his mental state. Gradually, he began receiving messages from other former hospital employees and acquaintances who supported the public perception of his racist behavior. These people shared their stories of how they themselves had been victims of his discriminatory practices. Each new revelation and testimony of his behavior only increased his fear and sense of defeat. Dr. Lancaster soon realized that he was part of a larger system of problems, and that his own behavior and actions were having a catastrophic impact on his life. He began to realize that his fear was not only about threats and physical danger, but also about the destruction of his own identity and professional reputation. As the trials continued and new allegations emerged, he faced increasing fears that the future might be even darker and more uncertain. Dr. Lancaster was plunged into a world of fear and self-destruction, and his life was still under threat. This dark side of his past and present left him in a state of constant fear, which became a new aspect of his existence. The situation with Dr. Lancaster continued to escalate, and his life became increasingly strained. Every day, he sank deeper into a world of fear and self-destruction. Meanwhile, the conflict between him and the patients who suffered from his discriminatory behavior continued to escalate. Lancaster's most vocal opponent was Kira, a patient who had previously visited the hospital and fallen victim to his racist practices. Kira, an African-American woman, suffered serious medical complications due to Dr. Lancaster's ignorance and lack of proper medical care. After her case was exposed, she became an activist speaking out against racism in the medical establishment. Kira gathered a group of supporters and advocates who had also been victims of discrimination. They organized a series of public events and campaigns aimed at drawing attention to cases of bias in medicine and demanding justice for victims. They also initiated legal proceedings against Lancaster, seeking to ensure that it was punished for the suffering caused. Dr. Lancaster, aware that Kira and her supporters would not back down, tried to fight the allegations and defend himself against the attacks. He and his lawyers began working hard to undermine the reputations of Kira and the other accusers, claiming that they were distorting the facts and exaggerating the situation. However, in response to these actions, Kira and her team collected even more evidence and testimony proving discrimination and bias at the hospital. The conflict became even more tense when Kira began to discuss the personal details of her case publicly, which led to additional pressure on Lancaster. In public appearances and at rallies, she shared her experiences and stories about how her health and life were damaged by the doctor's actions. These public statements brought her even more attention and supported her position in the public eye. Lancaster, for his part, began to use his resources to counterattack. He attempted to discredit Kira and her team, accusing them of manipulation and attempts to harm him, but his efforts to defend himself were ineffective. The publication of new evidence and investigations only increased public condemnation of his actions. As the trial continued, Kira and her supporters began to face increasing difficulties. They had to contend not only with Lancaster, but also with his supporters who were trying to create chaos and sabotage their efforts. The attacks and threats they began to receive became part of their new reality. Despite this, Kira remained determined and continued to fight, knowing that her actions could change the system and bring justice. Dr. Lancaster, on the other hand, continued to struggle for his survival in the professional and public spheres. His fear of possible consequences and the fight against accusations continued to mount. He understood that every action he took could lead to even more serious consequences and that his future was still uncertain. The conflict between Lancaster and Kira became emblematic of a larger struggle against racism and bias. While both sides continued their efforts, the outcome of this struggle remained unknown. The trial and public campaigns continued to unfold, and each new day brought new trials and challenges for both Lancaster and Kira. Several months had passed since the start of the bitter confrontation between Dr. Lancaster and Kira. Gradually, the situation began to change for the better, despite the continuing disputes and difficulties. The trial, which was a landmark event, began to see positive changes. The trial against Lancaster led to several important results. The measures taken against him were quite severe. He was found guilty of some of the discrimination charges and received a severe sentence, which included the suspension of his medical license and the need to participate in retraining programs on equality and anti-discrimination. Lancaster was forced to publicly apologize and admit his mistakes, which was an important step in his rehabilitation processes. Kira and her team, having achieved significant victories in the judicial arena, also continued their work, focusing on broader reforms. Together with human rights organizations, they organized campaigns to educate health workers on the principles of inclusion and equality. These efforts attracted support and resources from various public and private organizations, which allowed for the creation of new educational programs and trainings. The hospital where the incidents occurred also began to implement systemic changes. In response to public pressure and the findings of the investigation, it adopted new measures to ensure equality and prevent discrimination. New protocols were developed to handle patient complaints and ensure transparency in medical practice. It began a reform of its human resources policies aimed at attracting a diverse workforce and improving service levels. Gradually, the atmosphere at the hospital began to change. Previously hidden cases of discrimination became less frequent, and healthcare workers began to pay more attention to issues of inclusion and equality. The hospital began holding regular trainings and seminars for employees aimed at preventing racism and bias. Along with these positive changes, the improved environment in the medical facility also contributed to better relationships between staff and patients. The transparency and openness achieved through the reforms allowed patients to feel more confident and safe when receiving medical care. This led to increased trust in the hospital and an improved reputation. Kira, seeing these changes, felt that her efforts were beginning to bear fruit. Although the fight for equality and justice was not yet over, she saw that her actions and activism had played a key role in the initial changes. She continued to work on new initiatives and projects aimed at combating racism and improving the healthcare system. Dr. Lancaster, now without a medical license and under public pressure, also began a process of self-reflection and rethinking his actions. While his personal life and career were devastated, he began working on his recovery and trying to find new ways to apply his knowledge and experience in the field of education and awareness on issues of equality and inclusion. The gradual improvements were made possible by the efforts of all parties involved. Although the problems of racism and bias were not yet completely eliminated, the steps taken were an important start for long-term change. These changes showed that continuous work, persistence, and activism can lead to significant results and improvements in the system. History continued to unfold, and while the path to full justice was still far away, the reforms and changes that had begun to take place showed that progress was possible. Kira, Lancaster, and others involved in this complex process understood that their efforts were an important step toward a more just and inclusive society. Several years have passed since the changes in the hospital and the fight against discrimination began. The gradual improvement of the situation in the medical institution continued, and the positive changes became more obvious and tangible. The hospital at the center of the scandal has been able to restore its reputation through reforms and efforts to eliminate racism and bias. Since then, new policies and procedures have been implemented to create a more inclusive and supportive environment. In particular, an independent monitoring board was created to ensure compliance with anti-discrimination standards and ensure transparency in patient care processes. Dr. Lancaster, after his medical license was suspended, began actively working on his rehabilitation. He took up teaching, educating medical professionals and students on issues of equality and anti-discrimination. Lancaster also began working on writing a book about his experiences and the lessons he learned, which helped him realize and correct his previous mistakes. His changes were noticed, and he began to receive recognition for his efforts in education and awareness. Kira and her team continued their activism, but now their focus was on positive change and supporting those who continued to fight discrimination. They began new projects to create and distribute educational materials about equality in medicine and other areas of life. Their work brought attention to new successes and allowed them to strengthen connections with other organizations and initiatives aimed at combating discrimination. The hospital also launched new initiatives to improve patient engagement and quality of care. Feedback programs were introduced to allow patients to be more involved in the service delivery process and to report any concerns or complaints. These measures helped to create a more trusting relationship between medical staff and patients. Community support increased, and the hospital received recognition for its reform efforts. New inclusion initiatives led to the creation of an internship program and grants for students from diverse communities, which helped increase diversity in the healthcare workforce. These programs helped attract new talent and foster an inclusive and equitable healthcare environment. Over time, the positive impact of the reforms became visible in other healthcare institutions and areas of public life. The successes achieved at the hospital became an example for other organizations, which began to implement similar measures to eliminate discrimination and bias. This process led to an overall improvement in the healthcare system and increased trust and satisfaction among patients. Kira, now a leading figure in the field of anti-discrimination, continued to inspire others to take action. She organized conferences and workshops to share her experiences and best practices. Her work made it clear that efforts to change the system could produce results, and her achievements became an important symbol of the possibilities for improvement. Dr. Lancaster and Kira's story, despite its difficult beginnings, now served as an example of how overcoming adversity and working to right wrongs can lead to meaningful change. The journey to full justice and equality was not yet complete, but successful reforms and positive changes were important steps along the way. Their story showed that despite difficulties and challenges, joint efforts and resilience can lead to a more just and inclusive society. It has been 7 years since the hospital began making dramatic changes in fighting for equality and justice. The time and effort invested in reform and activism have paid off. Much has changed, and these changes have had a profound impact on society as a whole. Black people and other groups that have historically faced systemic discrimination have made significant strides toward equality. The progress that has been made was the result of a concerted effort by activists, advocates, and organizations that continue to work to eliminate racial and ethnic bias. In medicine, the situation has changed dramatically. New policies and procedures implemented in the hospital and other medical institutions have contributed to the creation of an equal and inclusive environment. Black healthcare workers and patients have become actively involved in decision-making and defining new standards of care. Education and awareness programs on equality have become mandatory for all medical institutions, which has contributed to a more sensitive and respectful approach to each patient. Kira, who continued her activism, became a symbol of change and equality. She led a national campaign to combat racism in various areas of life. Her efforts led to the creation of new laws and initiatives aimed at ensuring equality in education, employment, and healthcare. Kira also became the author of a book in which she told about her journey, overcoming difficulties and successes in the fight for justice. Dr. Lancaster, although he continued to face challenges in his life, also played a role in this process. His involvement in education and outreach helped him understand the importance of change and the need to combat discrimination. He became a member of a committee that was developing new standards and guidelines for healthcare institutions. Lancaster began to receive recognition for his efforts in education and equity, and his work helped further advance reform. Society as a whole changed for the better. Black people and other groups that had been discriminated against began to actively participate in public and political life. Leadership positions and important roles became more accessible to people from different racial and ethnic groups. Education and employment became more accessible and equal, which contributed to a higher standard of living and social well-being. Social and legal changes continued to evolve. Global and local anti-racism initiatives began to yield real results. Respect and understanding for diversity and inclusion increased in society, creating a more harmonious and cohesive environment. Kira and her team continued to work on new projects and initiatives to strengthen the equality achieved and support those who continued to face discrimination. Their work became an important example of how joint efforts and persistence can lead to significant changes in society. The story that began with the fight against discrimination and racism ended on a positive note. Although the path to equality was difficult and full of challenges, the changes achieved became an important symbol of victory over bias and injustice. The society that achieved equality could now be proud of having made significant steps towards a more just and inclusive world for all its members. After 7 years of relentless struggle, reforms and public pressure, the society had made significant strides in ensuring equality for all its members. Changes in medicine, politics and social spheres were visible, and Black people, like other groups, could now enjoy equal opportunities and respect. Kira, who became a symbol of change, continued to inspire others with her example. She organized events, conferences, and trainings where she shared her experiences and successes. Her work contributed to the dissemination of best practices and the creation of new opportunities for communities that had previously faced discrimination. Her book, in which she shared her path to success, inspired thousands of people and continued to be an important source of knowledge and motivation. Dr. Lancaster, who had his own journey to awareness and change, was also part of this positive transformation. His involvement in educational initiatives and commissions helped improve standards of medical practice and strengthen the anti-discrimination system. His work in public recognition became a symbol of the possibility of change and correction. Society as a whole saw tangible results. Blacks and other previously discriminated groups began to occupy more prominent positions in various fields, including medicine, business, and politics. Rights and opportunities that were previously unavailable were now a reality for many people. However, despite the successes achieved, the work to improve society continued. Kira, Lancaster and other activists continued to draw attention to new challenges and problems, striving to make the world even more just and equal. As I conclude this story, I want to ask you, dear listeners, consider what you can do to create a more just and inclusive world. How can you support those who face bias and discrimination? What steps can you take to help create a more equal society? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to share it with your friends and family. Discuss it, reflect on its lessons, and try to apply these lessons to your own life. Your opinions and actions can contribute to positive change and help others see that each of us can be part of the solution. Thank you for your attention and support. I hope that the story you heard will inspire you to take action and help create a more just and respectful world for everyone. And so our story has come to an end. We have seen how perseverance, the desire to change the world for the better, and joint efforts can overcome even the most serious obstacles. The story of Kira and Dr. Lancaster, their fight against discrimination and successful reforms have become an important lesson for all of us. Let their achievements inspire us, and let each of us find our role in creating a more just and inclusive world. Remember that change begins with us and that every step, every action, matters. Thank you for being with us throughout this story. Share it with your friends, reflect on its lessons, and keep working to make the world a better place. Until next time and new stories, your participation and support are very important. We wish you all the best in your efforts to promote equality and justice.